Hi, welcome. Do you hear me? Puppies are a lot of work at the beginning, right? Especially during the potty training. It's exhausting. I know exactly what you mean. Like the first month or two that I had Venus, it was crazy. It was like every hour, every 2 hours, you had to go outside, because she had to go out and go potty, or at least you had to preemptively take them out because if not, there was going to be some kind of surprise at home. And it was really good too for redirecting me, from like all the things I was stressed about to focus on the dog and to focus on the potty training. Like I think you mentioned too, in your email the other day, how you're barely thinking about the narc anymore because you're so focused on the puppy. So that's awesome. That's awesome. You've hardly ever thought about the narc. I know, that's wonderful. Plus, I mean, there is no unconditional love like that of a dog. Well, you might not think about him anymore. Yeah, yeah. And the amazing thing about the dog is like dogs love you so much. Like I don't think a human could ever love like a dog can. And when they do something bad, all of their body language tells you, like they can't lie. Like if my dog does something that she knows she's not supposed to, like maybe she pees on the floor or something, and then she's like hiding in the corner, her ears are down, her body's like all hunched over, like I'm like, Venus, what's going on, what'd you do? And she's looking at me like, can't lie. Can't lie, can't deceive you, you always know what's going on. Yeah, they know the game is up. They don't have that cognitive function that humans have, to lie and deceive. That's the amazing thing about a dog is they're so faithful, they're so loyal. They screw up sometimes, they make a mess, they shit all over things, but they're not going to lie and they're always going to love you. Yeah, I think that was really serendipitous for you that your son wanted a dog and Ace ended up finding you. And I'm really glad he's doing better. He's not going to have to suffer anymore. And you guys can help each other. He needed you too, I'm sure. He needed to feel your love. He needed your companionship and you needed him. And that's really magical and beautiful. That's awesome. Yeah, it's like a reason to get out of bed in the morning too. Like when things get really bad, and sometimes they are, and sometimes things are really amazing for a really long time, and then one day you just wake up and like everything is on your mind, and you don't even want to get out of bed, but then you look over and there's this like adorable little creature waiting for you, and it's like you have to get out of bed. Somebody has to go outside. Somebody wants to get fed, and they're so happy to see you, and they have so much love. And that really changes things. I've heard from so many people who, have been through abusive relationships, or maybe they're just really depressed, or they have, other mental health issues, and they got a dog and then everything changed. It was like they had a reason to live. It was like a life insurance policy. Like they wanted to live for something. They had a reason to get out of bed. They had someone to focus on, someone to love them. Your daughter was worried about him. She's in Australia. Oh, he gets me up. He's so happy to see me in the morning. Yeah, it's the best. It's the best, see that smiling face every morning. So happy to see you. Yeah, that's something too. What a stark difference because I don't know about your narcissist, but a lot of the ones that I had known, including my mother, in the morning is when they start right in. Like the moment you wake up, it's something, and they're putting something on you, and it's almost like it's because that sets the tone then for the day. Like your whole day then is just it's essentially like destroyed because you wake up and they're throwing, whether it's like guilt or drama or an attack or something like that, and then like you start the day with this like horrible attitude and feeling like crap. And wow, what a difference to wake up to a happy puppy, who just like wants to cheer you up and love you and kiss you and hang out with you. And it's a total different way to start the day. Narc needs very little sleep. I know. It's really surprising how little sleep they can get away with, and how much they love to disturb your sleep too. Like, that's something I've noticed in my life, and also from many other people telling me, like, that the narcissist, the psychopath, whomever would intentionally sleep deprive them, and I really think that at some level they must have realized that the more sleep deprived the person was, the more delirious they were, the more exhausted they were, the less clearly they could think, the more brain fog there is, the harder it is to think clearly, to think rationally, and the easier it was to trigger them into that fight flight state, and to get them, to get them into those fear-based states so they would react from the lower level emotions versus like being able to think clearly about things. And that's, yeah, it seems like a common tactic that they use to sleep deprive their targets. And my favorite too is like when you wake up the next morning and they're like, so how'd you sleep? And it's like, they know very well what they're doing, and they love to do that. Or I had a roommate once who would wake up really early and I would sleep in later, and she would always find ways to wake me up in the morning. Like, maybe she would come over to my bed and my dog was sleeping with me, and she'd be like, hello, little Venus, good morning, good morning. I'm like, I'm sleeping here. Like, do you not notice I'm sleeping here? Or like, then she would go in the kitchen and make a lot of noise. And then one morning she texted me at like 6:30 in the morning to tell me that she broke, like the coffee press, and to be careful. And it's like, no, it didn't even occur to her to like leave a note. She thought about texting me. And then on top of that, when she came home hours later, she walked in the door and the first thing she said was, hey, how are you? How was your morning? How did you sleep? It's like, wow. It's like, clearly that's a tactic that they use. They love to sleep deprive people. They love to get them really upset right before bed so they can't sleep, or wake them up in the middle of the night, or wake them up in the morning. And I'd rather be woken up by a sweet little puppy kicking me than that sort of thing. 5 or 6 hours. I've heard of a lot of them, they sleep less than that even. Some of them like 4 hours. I really don't know how they function. I don't know if it's like adrenaline, it might be like the survival adrenaline but I don't understand, and something I also noticed too is how they crash. They would get to points, I noticed this more in relationships, like intimate relationships, where we get to points where suddenly they would just be like crashed out. We'd be watching movies or something and they would just be asleep on the couch for like hours and really early in the night. And I also noticed that they were doing this like right before they were about to like start cultivating some other source of supply. Like, they would be planning, they already maybe met somebody, or they were planning on meeting somebody, but usually they already met somebody and they were planning on spending time with them and getting them into the picture. And so it was like they were crashing on our time in order to like gather up the energy to go do it. But yeah, I don't know how they function on less sleep than that. And I also wonder, like, is it because they can't sleep because, at some point they realize what they're doing is awful. Like, for the most part, from what I understand is they understand the difference between right and wrong. They just choose wrong. They consciously choose wrong. But maybe at some level, there's some kind of, of guilt about that. And maybe that's what wakes them up. Like, maybe that's why they can't totally sleep. His father was a noticeable narc, horrible man, but the ex seemed the opposite. You mean his father was very noticeably the narc, like it was obvious he was awful, but it seemed like your ex was a good person? Is that what you mean? He was deceiving you? Yeah. Yeah, so it sounds like your ex was more of the covert narcissist. Yeah. Yeah, his father was probably more of the overt type. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think the covert ones, what is the sociopath then? The sociopath, I think, is the one that is he is like the most refined, if you want to call it refined. But they are the most manipulative, the most calculated. They don't have this sort of like immediate gratification thing that a lot of narcissists have. They have the ability to delay gratification, to cultivate, you know, this thing where they set up and set up and set up the target, and they're meticulously planning very calculatedly the demise of that person. And, you know, the narcissist, typically it's like the narcissist needs the narcissistic supply in the form of like attention and admiration and doting and that sort of thing. Whereas the sociopath, it's more like he wants something you have, or he just hates and despises the fact that you have whatever that is. And whatever that is doesn't even have to be tangible. It might be that he's coveting something tangible like a house or a car or, you know, something physical. But normally it's just like he sees your joy, he sees your success, he sees your happiness, and he has this pathological envy about it, and no problem waiting and calculatedly, you know, building this thing up until the very end when he moves in and takes it all away and destroys you. And the sociopath, I think, is like the most sadistic. Like he very well knows the difference between right and wrong, and he chooses to do things that cause a person to suffer because he gets off on that. He gets off on their emotional pain, on their emotional suffering. It's like, it's the only thing that feeds them because they're so empty and destroyed inside that they can only get off on other people's pain. I think I posted something like maybe a month ago or so called Schadenfreude, I think is the German word, which is like getting pleasure off of other people's suffering. And that's really the key thing for the sociopath. I felt like he liked causing you pain. Yeah, they do. It's like, you'll see them like that smirk that they get, you know, on the one side of their mouth when they're watching you, and you could see it out of the corner of your eye, and it's usually when you're just like destroyed, like devastated and destroyed, and they're over there. Yeah, he smirked. They're over there in the corner just like smirking, walking away. They love it. Like they get off on it. It's what feeds them. They have some kind of, it seems like an inverted polarity where, you know, fear and negativity feeds them. You know, for most of us, like fear and negativity drains us, and for them it's like it makes them stronger. It's really bizarre. Yeah, I think the sociopaths too, they're also very covert. You know, usually they're exemplary figures in their community or even in society, because the sociopath tends to be the one who works his way up to like CEO, COO, big politician, you know, banker. Like they're holding high positions in society. You know, and they get there because of these ruthless qualities that they have. They're not afraid, you know, to deal with really awful stuff and make really ruthless decisions because of who they are. And then those qualities become admired and sought after in positions of companies and organizations and politics, you know, where there's no ethics really. Are narcs like that too, or is he a sociopath? Are narcs like what? He has a high power job in a bank. Yeah, that makes sense. Are narcs sadistic? I don't really think as much. I think to a lesser degree, it's more about the jealousy with the narcissist, like the typical narcissist. They just feel jealous of what you have, and they want that. But I don't think with the narcissist it's as sadistic as it is with the sociopath. The sociopath, like I said, that's the person that, I mean, they can wait months and years of like meticulously and calculatedly working up this thing where they come in and get you and then just revel in your suffering. That to me, the high level of sadism, that to me is the typical sociopath. I think for the narcissist, it's more of just like a survival thing. It's like, if you imagine them like an infant, and it's like they're scanning their environment, trying to figure out where their needs are going to be met. You know, where can they get their basic needs met? You know, who's going to give them a house to live? Who's going to feed them? Who's going to change their diapers and eat their shit? Who's going to take care of them and give them the attention, the love, the admiration, the affection, all that they need? The sociopath, I think that's the one who's really dangerous, because, you know, the narcissist will play a lot of games and they'll do a lot of things to destroy you out of their jealousy. But the sociopaths will go to like untold lengths, and will always come out smelling like a rose. Like nobody sees it. The community doesn't see it. Rarely do other people see it. Usually they have everybody fooled, and usually they're incredibly charming. Like the sociopath tends to be the most charming of all of them. Yeah, you think he's a sociopath. That makes sense. You know, if you saw this like high level of sadism where, like, you know, and it was maybe like a long period of time too that he invested in you before he did anything really wicked. In fact, he might have even come in like the savior, the hero at first, and that's why it's so shocking, you know, later. Like, 'cause at first you're like, it seems like this person really cared about you, was really looking out for you and was helping you. And then all of a sudden they're doing this. And so it's like, that's why it's such a mind fuck, because you can't get your mind around it. You're like, but why would he do that if he did this? And so you're going back and forth, and it's almost like your mind can't accept that, you know, what he's doing, and the fact that he's doing it simply for the pleasure of making you suffer. That, I think, is like one of the hardest things to accept for a lot of victims, because like, we don't think like that. Like, we're empathic. We care about other people. When we see someone suffering, it's like we're suffering. Like, we feel that, you know, we want to help them. We want to make them better. We, you know, even if it's just like you want to like hug this person and let them know everything is going to be okay. Whereas, you know, a sociopath is enjoying it. Like, they enjoy other people's suffering and pain. And, you know, I think that's just, it's almost like I get so many messages from people and they're like, well, but is he really a psychopath or a sociopath? Like, is this really abuse? Is this really? And it's like, yeah, like they just, they can't get it through their mind. The cognitive dissonance is so strong that the denial just wants to kick in and look back to, you know, the original image that you had of the person, which was, you know, maybe a pleasant person, or a person who was flattering you, or, you know, someone who was maybe even helping you or rescuing you from some situation in your life. And I think the best repellent for people like that is to be in a place in your life where you have everything taken care of. You have all your basic needs taken care of. You are completely self-sufficient, and you don't have to rely on someone for anything. And if someone new comes into your life, then it's like there's that much more in your life. Like, you know, your cup is full and someone new comes into your life, and then you have this overflowing, you know, beauty and joy and enjoyment and whatnot in your life. Because if there is a lack, if you're desperately needing something like a financial necessity or some kind of like desperate need for a connection because of this deep loneliness that you're unable to fulfill yourself, someone like that, a sociopath, a psychopath, a narcissist, will see that. They'll hone in on that. They'll smell it like a shark smells blood, you know, a mile away, and they'll come in and they'll figure out exactly the role to play, you know, to get you to trust them, to offer you whatever it is that you desperately need. And then essentially you're giving them the control over your life, especially if it's finances. That's really dangerous. I've been in that situation a couple of times myself. And like wanted to leave, and there was no way out. Like there was a way out, but I didn't see the way out for a long time. I felt like I was stuck there because I was financially trapped. And then that person further erodes and erodes and erodes at your self-esteem. And then you start to believe that you can't do it. You start to believe that you can't resolve that situation in your life and that you can't survive without them being there. And that's really dangerous. So I think it's always really important, you know, to have all your basic needs met, and not just in the physical world, but also in the emotional world, like to have that love for yourself, the respect for yourself, the self-esteem for yourself, where if someone compliments you, you can say, okay, thank you, you know, and it feels good. And if someone, you know, says something really awful about you, you can say, oh, okay, all right, you know, see you later, and want nothing to do with them. But it doesn't destroy you, because your sense of self-esteem is not so easily shaken by someone else. It's not so inflated by someone else, and it's not so destroyed by someone else either, where you have that. I think it comes from Buddhism, where they say, you know, you should react to the same way when someone compliments you and gives you a sense of approval, or when someone says something awful, you should react in the same way, right? And so in other words, like you're not being knocked off balance. You're not being knocked off center based on what the world tells you, because if people realize they can tell you certain things to manipulate you in certain ways, then they have you like under their finger, and they know exactly what to do to control you. Thanks. Now it adds up. I was in the fog for so long. I know we all got stuck in that fog, you know, and there's a lot of complex things that are going on, like the brain chemistry and the neurological programming and the amygdala hijack and the trauma bonding, Stockholm syndrome, all of that, the sleep deprivation, the cognitive dissonance, you know, low energy, all of that contributes to that brain fog, you know. And really intelligent people get tricked into this all the time, because it's not about the intelligence. What it affects are like the primal functioning of the human being. And that's why it can completely bypass and override the neocortex, the thinking brain, and just shut all that down. And all the energy and memory and emotion is in the primal stuff and the survival mechanisms. And that's why the brain fog is there, and you're not really sure like what to believe and what's real. And, you know, that cognitive dissonance, the confusion, the denial, you know, all of that is in the brain fog. And, you know, and everybody comes out of that when they're ready, you know. And I think it's good to expose yourself to as much education as possible, learn as much as you can, but also remember that knowledge is only potential power. You know, you can learn about things as much as you want, but until you do something, right? Until you do something about it, until you do something different, it doesn't become real power. Knowledge is the potential power. Wisdom is knowledge through experience, transmuted through experience. That's when it becomes real, is when you experience it for yourself. That's when it becomes wisdom. And experience is action, right? It's doing something. And so, you know, when you start to do something different, you start to have different results. And when you have different results, then that changes your perspective of things. And when your perspective changes, then your belief systems change. And now everything is changed, right? But before any of that happens, when you're still in the rut, doing the same thing, you know, and getting more and more into that brain fog, it becomes really, really hard to think clearly, to see clearly, to get out of that, you know. And then later you look back, right? When you're cleared and all of that's gone, and you look back and you're like, wow, how didn't I see it? You know, it's so clear to you now. Or like you're telling the story to someone else and they're like, oh my God, like, how did you stay in that? It's so awful. And it's like, well, it didn't look like that at first, you know. It definitely didn't look like that, because they know, you know. It's like, it's what do they say? It's about the frog, right? If you throw a frog into a pot of boiling water, it's going to jump right out. But if you put the frog into water and it's like lukewarm, and then you very slowly start cranking up the heat, eventually the frog boils to death, because it doesn't notice. It doesn't realize that there has been this steady and slow turning up of the heat, and then it's too late. And that's exactly how we get into these abusive situations, is it doesn't start out like that. It starts out very beautiful, usually on the surface. And then, of course, when you're looking back, you can recognize those red flags, right? Like it was too much. It was too good to be true. It was too much attention. It was too intense. It was manufactured, right? And all that becomes clear. But when you're in it at the beginning, it doesn't look like that. It looks really beautiful. And then you get into it. And then once you're in it, then you're stuck in that cognitive dissonance, and you're like, but it was this, and I know it can be this, but it looks like this now. And it just really like goes zzz inside your brain, right? And then the thinking brain shuts off, and then you're back in the fear and anxiety of the primal brain and unable to make, wise decisions. And that's where everybody gets stuck in the abuse. It's the brain fog, and that's why taking care of your brain health is so important, like your physical brain health and how you're nourishing it with quality foods and water and positive information, because that affects your brain as well. Getting exercise and whatnot, and breathing and meditating, and then also reprogramming your mind as well. That's really, really key to do a lot of that work, because, so many of us, got to that point where we felt like we're on the brink of our sanity. Like we didn't know if we were going to lose it. I remember points being like, I didn't know, what was real and what wasn't anymore, especially when you just get out of the relationship and suddenly all these things are coming out and you're discovering things that had happened, or you're with distance and perspective, you're realizing things that happened that you didn't get before. And it's so hard to accept that really happened, because you really don't want to believe it. You don't want to believe that someone would do that. You don't want to believe that someone would treat another person like that. You don't want to believe that someone treated you like that. But that was the case. And until you get that distance and that space, it's like impossible to see through that fog. And, leaving an abusive relationship, it's like that Martin Luther King quote, it's faith. Faith is taking the first step when you can't see the whole staircase yet. And that's where we all were. We were leaving those relationships, is just on a leap of faith, not knowing what to do, not knowing what was going to happen afterward, but just taking that first step and just having the faith that things were going to get better, knowing that everything was going to be all right, because we were taking that first step away. And, it's always with distance and perspective that we see things differently and a lot clearer, because when you're in it, you're stuck in that fog. It's like impossible to see through. Do they ever look back on their life and feel sorry for what they've done? I don't really think so. I think that's what the entitlement is. The entitlement being one of the key characteristics, and they have, according to the DSM, they have to have so many out of this list to be officially, NPD or BPD or histrionic or whatever. And the key characteristic that pretty much all of them have is that sense of entitlement. They believe they deserve it. And that's why I don't think they're sorry. I really don't. And even, when they have said sorry, it's never a true apology. Like the sorries that I have heard, I'll tell you, if you heard him, you would really believe him. I mean, if I played the tape for normal, healthy people to hear, they'd probably be like, yeah, that person's sorry. But then what happens is the action following that up, and the action following that up. And maybe it wasn't that day, and maybe it wasn't tomorrow, maybe it wasn't the next week, maybe it was months later, where their actions proved that they weren't sorry. And those are the worst ones, is when it really sounds believable. And then there are other times when, it doesn't sound so believable, or maybe it kind of sounds believable. And maybe like you have this 3-hour-long exhausting conversation where they finally realized, they finally said sorry, they finally took accountability for what they did to you, and now you're like utterly exhausted. And then at the very end of your conversation, it's like none of that happened. They're right back to where they were. Or maybe it's the next morning. Maybe like you go to bed and you're exhausted and you're like, oh, thank God, we finally worked through that. They finally admitted it. And you wake up the next morning and then they're like, that didn't happen. That's not how I feel. And you're like, what? But you just said that, and that's part of that cognitive dissonance, where they'll flip-flop like that and just drive you absolutely crazy. Or the other way of apologizing and sorry is when they say that they're sorry, but They're sorry, but if you hadn't said this or done that, they wouldn't have done that. They're sorry, but if you were more open-minded sexually and would have engaged in these very sadistic behaviors with them, then they wouldn't have cheated on you. Or they're sorry, but if you weren't working so hard, well, then they wouldn't have gone ahead and had an affair. Or they're sorry, that they didn't realize, maybe this is like a mother. They're sorry that they didn't realize, just how much the sexual abuse affected you when you were 5 years old. And that's the narcissist. Like, that's them saying, well, I'm telling you I'm sorry because that's the socially acceptable thing, and that's what I know that you want to hear, but I'm not really sorry because it's always about your fault. I'm sorry, but means I'm not really sorry. It means you did this thing, and that's why I did that, and I'm justified. I'm entitled to do that because you did this, or because you were a 5-year-old kid, and I just couldn't imagine how sexual abuse would have affected you. I mean, you said nothing happened, so why would I take you to a therapist? And there's no real apology behind that. Or maybe, and this is one I've heard as well, like, I'm sorry. And I mean, this person is like sobbing, like, I'm sorry. I just don't know how you could forgive me for that. But it's not really an apology. It's again, it's not like they're saying, I'm sorry that I did that. I'm sorry that I didn't recognize how much that sexual abuse incident affected you. I'm sorry I didn't protect you as a parent. I'm sorry I didn't think to take you to a psychotherapist to figure out what really happened and what we could do or should do or what help you might need. Or I'm sorry I just shoved it under the rug because I didn't want to believe it. They don't say those things because they feel entitled. They feel entitled to the actions they take. They're always justifying the actions they take based on what someone else did or, something that happened to them, which means that they have the right to treat people like that, to do that thing. And I think they go on the rest of their lives just justifying to themselves that sense of entitlement, why it's okay, and on top of that, may even think that, that not only was it okay what they did, but you deserved it for having done what you did. And then, it's very typical that the narcissist becomes the victim and pretends that they're the victim, and they may have really hurt you, but then they go on in life telling that story to themselves. They rewrite the history where they were the victim. And then they go and tell other people that they're the victim, and they just go on believing that. And, the sociopath being like the ultimate level of entitlement, where they know exactly what they're doing. They're doing it specifically to hurt you, specifically to evoke those emotions of suffering that feed them. And they believe they should do it and get away with it because that's just how entitled they are. They believe they have every right to treat people like that. It's like, it's the ultimate level of entitlement. And I think that's why they can't be sorry. I think that's why they're just not sorry. And why, at one moment they could pretend like they're sorry, or, or maybe, they have a glimpse of lucidity in a moment where they say that they're sorry, and maybe they actually feel a shred of sorry. But then the next moment that entitlement comes back, because that's their baseline. Like, that's where they are in that entitlement. And so the next moment that entitlement comes back, then they re-justify to themselves why they did that. And that's why they flip-flop in those conversations where you worked and worked and worked at this 3-hour conversation, and they finally accepted accountability and said they were sorry. And then the minute later, or the next hour, or the next morning, they're not sorry anymore. Now they're like, no, it's your fault again, and they go back to that because that entitlement just kicks back in. And that's why I don't recommend ever really taking to heart an apology, because it's another way that they can hook you, and a lot of times this comes through the hoovering, or this comes, when a victim is trying to leave the abuser, they will do this kind of hoovering or hooking or trying to hold you, where they're apologizing and saying that they're so sorry. And, they might be sobbing. They might really look like they're sorry on the surface, but it's just a surface display. They're just a really skilled actor and they don't really feel it. And that's not, I mean, you notice immediately in their actions later. I mean, sometimes it might take a little bit of time, you know, if you're not really close with that person and they just, you know, you get back in touch on social media and they tell you that they're sorry, and maybe you kind of develop a bit of, you know, an emailing or a phone calling relationship and you barely see this person. And so the intensity isn't as big and it takes you a few months to realize that their actions are still exactly the same. They're still not showing up when they say they're showing up really late, they're making you wait, they're just bullshitting around, and it's just clear, like they're just not sorry. They're just not. You know, I think that's a hard part too, because I think most of us, we get out of these relationships and we think, well, you know, if that person would just realize, do they ever realize how much they hurt me? If they could just realize, then I would feel better. And that's where you got to turn that back in on yourself and give yourself that validation. That was real. That happened. That was unjustified. I didn't deserve that. It was unfair. And I need to be there for myself. I need to not rely on that person for the I'm sorry, because it's the same dynamic as the relationship, you know, where you have two people and this person is flattering you, right? And so the more you start to like and depend on that flattery, the more you start to lean into this person, right? And then suddenly you're totally off balance, but you're being held up by this person, and then he steps away and you fall flat down, right? Same thing with the apology, where you're leaning back in again, you know, and when you lean in and give that approval, that validation, that sense of recognition of reality to that person, all they need to do is take one step away and you're flat on your face again. So you got to be there for yourself. You got to, you know, validate yourself, validate your feelings, validate your perceptions of reality, validate the fact that you deserve to have boundaries and you deserve to set your boundaries and to not allow people to treat you like that, and validate yourself that that wasn't fair, that it shouldn't be like that. People shouldn't treat other people like that. Even if he doesn't admit it, even if he or she gaslights you into believing that it's totally fine, it's okay, no big deal, it's not okay. You don't need to wait for that person to be sorry. You know, and that's the forgiveness work too. Like, it's not about them. The forgiveness work is about you. It's about releasing yourself from that connection, from the resentment and the bitterness and the anger, which just holds you down. Thinks it adds up. He has no boundaries and does not like that I had. Of course, yeah, they have no sense of boundaries. They have no problem abusing boundaries because they don't even see them. And even when you make them clear, they pretend like they're not there, or they're entitled to be special, and that boundary doesn't apply to them. And then, like you said, as soon as you set a boundary or have a boundary, and that boundary is stopping them from taking or doing whatever they want, they're going to be angry. They're going to be, you know, they're going to try to convince you that you're wrong for having that boundary. And it'll start subtly, like, well, you have a boundary. And if that doesn't trigger you to go, well, right, and start to bend on the boundary, then they're going to keep pushing, and then they're going to triangulate usually, and they're going to bring in other people's opinions or other people to tell you, or they're just going to tell you they talk to other people, and other people have no problem. You know, other people have no problem when they just show up in their house. Instead of like ringing the doorbell, they just jump the fence and they're suddenly standing in their living room. It's not a problem for them or for other people. It's just, you know, you have a problem that's not okay with you, and you can't buy that. You can't believe into that. You just got to trust yourself and know that you have those boundaries for a reason. You deserve to have boundaries. You have every right to have boundaries, because that's what keeps you safe. That's what keeps you protected. That's what protects what you value, what's important for you. And that's what keeps you from accepting responsibility for other people's shit. It's what allows you to remember, this is mine. This is my shit. I'm going to deal with this because this is mine. I'm going to own this. These are my feelings. These are my needs. This is what I need to own. And that's all you. And I am not responsible for that. And when you keep that boundary secure, then you know that when that person is trying to get you to break that boundary, you're like, no, I'm sorry. I did let you know this is my boundary right here. And if you don't like that, then this isn't going to work. This is a deal breaker for me. And, you know, moving forward, that's really, really key for those of us who got into these situations, is to work on the boundaries, you know. And the hardest part is to set and enforce that boundary without guilt and shame, because in the past you were shamed for having that boundary, and you were believed to feel guilty for expressing that boundary or for expressing your needs. You were meant to feel that you were needy for wanting to talk about something that happened, or you were meant to feel needy to want to talk to this person once a day, when before they were talking to you all the time, all day long, every day, and then suddenly they disappear and now you're needy because you want to talk to them. No, that's not acceptable. That's someone playing with you. That's someone abusing you. And you got to have that self-esteem to say, I deserve to have boundaries. I deserve to set this healthy boundary. I deserve to have, you know, to say that these are my needs. I take ownership of that. I need this to feel emotionally secure. I have these feelings. These are real feelings. I'm not just going to bury these feelings because you don't like them. You don't like what I'm talking about. And I have the right to have this boundary to protect what is important to me and what matters to me, and to not feel bullied into losing that boundary. Are there any other questions for today? Okay. Well, if there's no more questions for now, I'm going to wrap up. And again, I will be back here in less than 5 hours at 6 p.m. Pacific time, USA. We'll be back here for question and answer. So any other questions, I'll be happy to answer those then. I'll see you guys soon. Bye.